Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm John Zogby. I'm here with my son, Jeremy, my boss, as well. And many of you who've watched our podcast know that we bill it as real and unscripted. Well, this webinar is real and scripted. We have our last final polling results for the 2024 campaign, some surprises to be sure, and some warnings to be sure. You'll find those out in actually just a minute. It is a live webinar. You are unmuted. You are muted and cannot unmute yourself. Please, if you have questions, and we welcome them, we'll try to get to all of them if we can, but you'll have to participate via the chat, which is very easy to do down at the bottom of the screen. And let's just move on. Jeremy is going to start us off and take it from here with the PowerPoint.
And I'll kick it over to you. So we'll always begin with the methodology. And, you know, a lot of folks concluded they fielded their concluding poll on the 29th and the 30th of the month. And we know, if there's anything that we've learned, not only in this cycle, but especially the last 3 months, things can change on a whim.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, within 24 hours.
Yes.
And we caught a glimpse of that in late June, and it feels like ever since then we went into a vortex. So we at John Zogby Strategies thought it was imperative to have the latest possible poll that we could deliver. So we fielded on the 2nd of Saturday in the afternoon and ran it through the 3rd of November in the afternoon, tallied up the results. This is a national poll of 1,005 voters. That's a margin of error of plus or minus 3.2. That's very important because we're hearing a lot about this, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, but we always have to remember the margin of error. That's with the overall results. When we get into subgroups or subsets, demographics that is, they have a larger margin of error than the overall set. So this was an online poll, and we did very slight weighting, the typical stuff: party, of course, very important, age, gender, race, and those who have a college degree and those don't. And of course, by region of the United States. I'm going to do one last bit before I hand it over to my dad, who's going to get into the horse race and a lot of key indicators. A guide to reading this poll, because right now I'm hearing from everybody. I'm hearing from pundits, I'm hearing from journalists, as you are too, from politicos, from data junkies, political junkies, and there's talk on both sides of the aisle of a Harris surge and a Trump surge. And we as independent and accurate pollsters kind of have to laugh at this, right? Because when you're talking 1 or 2 point leads in a national poll, we're not talking surges. We're talking well within the margin of error. And our survey, our poll, is well within the margin of error. Another thing I want to point out to you is whether you're going to Real Clear Politics or whether you're going to 538, you may, or maybe you didn't notice, that virtually everybody right now, and as over the last week, are just releasing the two-way horse race. We are revealing to you both the four-way horse race as well as the two-way horse race, and those are two different ball games. We go with the four-way horse race because that's what's going to be on the ballot as voters vote. It includes 2 of the third-party candidates, the Libertarian Oliver and the Green Stein. And when you look at that, Harris has about a 3-point lead in the four-way. But when you go to the two-way, just Trump versus Harris, it boils down, or it comes down to a 2-point lead. Both are well within the margin of error. So I'm going to say this poll, National Poll of Likely Voters, it mimics it. It's projecting the turnout of the popular vote. In the final analysis, the results you're going to see, this is a tight race at this moment, and any victory is going to take place in the battleground states, and that's a different ball game. So I'm going to now turn it over to you.
Okay, So we begin. Well, let's go one more forward. Okay.
Yep.
There you go. This is the four-way horse race, and note please that it says decided voters, because what we do is we ask who they intend to vote for or already have voted for. Among those who say they're undecided, we ask who they're leaning toward, and then there's a very tiny percentage of folks who are not leaning or towards anyone, are still undecided. We eliminate that 2%. And so these are decided voters. And in the four-way horse race, we do see that 3-point lead that Jeremy mentioned. 49% for Kamala Harris, 46% for Donald Trump. Chase Oliver receives 3% and Jill Stein 2%. We do suspect, because there are last-minute deciders, maybe as high as 8 to 10% who could even change their minds, that those numbers for Oliver and Stein may go down. But right now, 49, 46. The two-way horse race, as Jeremy mentioned, Harris at 51%, Trump at 49%. Again, well within the margin of error, but still different from what other polls are showing at this point in time.
We'll go back.
Okay. So now, these are the advantages and disadvantages of each candidate from our poll. Harris takes the lead among the key independent voters, a little over 1 in 4 voters, 26%. She leads 51% to 38%, as well as with women, 55 to 43. And those older voters, that's a switch. Those over 65, particularly older women, she leads 58 to 39%. She leads comfortably among suburban voters, 50% to 44%. And again, that's going to be due to the power of selection among suburban women. She also leads handsomely among large city voters by 20 points. A plurality of voters say Harris better understands them. People like us is the term that we use in our polling, than does Trump. 46% to 37%. Democratic voters' top issues are better distributed compared to Republicans, and abortion is playing a key role in turning out women. It is the number one issue among Harris supporters. Among young women, Harris leads Trump 67% to 32%. Now let's look at Donald Trump. He leads Harris among first-time voters, 48 to 40%. What's really interesting is that he leads Harris 47 to 45 among those under 30, and that's because he has a lead among men and even a bigger lead among young men. In fact, young men versus young women, there is a 60-point gender gap, which is incredible. Trump leads among small city voters by 4 percentage points, you see, and among rural voters by 19 percentage points. Trump actually has taken the lead with Hispanic voters, 48% to Harris's 43%. And again, there is a gender gap, and there's also an income gap here, with Trump doing particularly well among male Hispanic voters and among lower middle income Hispanic voters. Although Harris still technically dominates the black vote, getting 73%, Trump has a pretty powerful showing at 19%, which is something that we've been tracking right along. These are weaker numbers for a Democrat, hence making it a bit closer. Compare this with the 96% of black voters that Barack Obama received and the 93% he received in 2012. Hillary Clinton was at 87%, as was Joe Biden in just 4 years ago. Again, there is a gap, a gender and race gap, with young men tending to support Trump at a higher percentage than young Black women. Republican voter intensity comes chiefly from inflation and immigration and the border crisis. Those are by far and away, as we'll see in a table, the one and two top issues for Republican voters, Trump voters. Among young men, Trump leads 62% to 23%. Just look over to the left for 1 second. Among young women, Harris leads 67% to 32%. Two different worlds. Reasons why voters chose their candidate.
Sure. So what was it? Is it because the Harris voters and the Trump voters like and trust their candidate? Is it because they dislike and distrust the other candidate, or that they actually agree with their candidate's policies? And this tells an interesting story here. We see the advantage that Harris has. She's more likable among her voters than Trump is. But you can start to see in the blue box that there's more of a protest vote, that the vote for Harris is an anti-Trump vote. And then what I think really drives the story home is the gold bar. And that's the actual in agreement with my candidate's policies. And that's the strength that Trump has, that he has over a third of his actual voters who agree with his policies, versus Harris, who only has 20% of her voters that agree with her policies. Again, Harris is more as a likability factor and a distrust and a dislike of the other candidate. And Trump's is a likability factor and those who agree with his policies. I think that's a pretty interesting story there. This is a key indicator. Maybe not as strong as the horse race, but very indicative, I think. We have Kamala leading, and so why not ask who they actually think will win? Of course, I do have to highlight that over a fifth just don't know. But among those who feel like they know or they think they know, it's a tight race. They're telling us it's a tight race. There's 1 point more, 40%, who say Trump, they believe will actually win, 39%. But what we see is they expect nearly a virtual tie. You alluded to about the importance of who better understands voters, voters like me from their perspective. And clearly we see here, this is the likability factor. This is the factor of Harris, who's perceived as understanding voters better, and understanding their needs better. And we see a pretty significant advantage there. I would put that on the board. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, this has always been a very important indicator for a Democratic candidate. When Democrats lose that edge on understanding people like you and me, they lose the election. Prime example, Ronald Reagan versus Jimmy Carter, and then, of course, Walter Mondale versus Bill Clinton, then, and Barack Obama. On the negative side, Al Gore. George W. Bush was the one they wanted to have a beer with. That was our question, incidentally, that famous question. They did not want to have a beer with Al Gore. In this instance, this tells me that Kamala Harris, even though we saw 1/3 of her voters saying that they were backing her because they disliked Donald Trump, she at least has bonded with the voters on this.
Pretty powerful. These are the top 5 issues among all voters. We asked, I think it was 11. And so I wanted to take where there were 5, because after 5, there was a pretty significant drop off. But I mean, of course, no surprise here. there isn't a poll, I think, out there that isn't showing economy and inflation. Of course, it depends on the firm. Some firms just say jobs and the economy. We put in inflation because an amazing thing has happened in the last year or two, where from my vantage point, I've seen the word inflation become an everyday part of our lexicon, of our English language. 4 or 5 years ago, that was more or less a policy or wonk term. There we go with immigration at the border taking number two, 33%, 20 percentage points lower than the economy and inflation, just showing you how important the economy is to U.S. voters. But take note that abortion, which over the summer, and especially towards the end of the summer, was in the teens. And you were saying this, I have to point out, you were saying as we get close to the election, that will become a factor. It has become the number 3 spot, saving our democracy or our republic, depending on, of course, how you view that. 22% said that is a key issue. When we break this out by party, we're going to really illuminate this. And then keeping the U.S. out of another major war, 15%, that is also on the minds of voters in driving who they decide to vote for. So let's look at Harris voters. Let me just, before I get into this, let me show you something here. Watch this. Look at that. Okay. There's a story right there.
Yeah.
Harris voters are better distributed. They have, in the words of an investor, they have spread their basket among very important issues. 45% of Harris voters are voting for her because of abortion, 39% because of the economy and inflation, 37% for the sense of saving our democracy. That's intensity. The environment playing a major role, almost a fifth of the Harris voters. Those are 4 issues well spread out. Now watch this. I call this the Trump juggernaut. This is the story of intensity. This is also the story of the Trump messaging team basically putting all of their eggs in 2 baskets: inflation in the economy and immigration and the situation or the crisis at the border. 68% of Trump voters voting because of inflation in the economy, 61% because of the border. Now look at that fall. I mean, that's just a massive drop to the 3rd issue, which is keeping the U.S. out of war, and then closely with crime and public safety. But that's a pretty powerful story. One could argue that strength, that's right, why I call it the juggernaut. Other could argue that on the flip side, that's putting all your eggs in 2 baskets, and that's not necessarily a wise idea.
Little surprised that crime and public safety, which had dominated the headlines for much of the year, came out as low as it has.
Yeah. Yep. And so what we saw is abortion going up and then crime and public safety coming down. This is the key. This is where you see independents and how really they are kind of a balancing effect. They take elements of both, and both stories of what we just saw. Inflation and economy by far the most important. You have to forgive me. This is a result of flipping from Word to Apple, and so I'm going to read those numbers so they're more closely for you. 58% for independents. That's in how they decide their vote. 28% going with immigration and the border. 24% saving democracy and the republic. That's very important. My cursory glance at the data tells me that that's those independents swinging towards Kamala Harris, hence why she is ahead by, I think, 13 percentage points among this very key group. And then abortion. 23% that says, if you can't see it, of independents went with their candidate because of abortion. Obviously, that is an advantage for Harris. Why don't you take this?
Okay. Who better handles the following issues? Now, That's an important factor, I think, in tightening up this race. And even with the Kamala Harris lead, she seems to have closed the gap on handling inflation and the economy. 43%, 48% for Trump. That I think is a very important development, and that perhaps people are feeling better about the economy than they were, or worse about Donald Trump. On the other hand, immigration and the border, trumps 52% say that he's better able to handle it than the 38% who say that Harris is. Flip side now on abortion, a big issue in this campaign, the number one issue to remind you among Harris voters. 53% say she is better able to, and 33% say that Trump 33% say that Trump is better able to. And then on foreign policy, it's a wash. 44% Harris, 46% Trump. That reflects two things. One is Gaza, to be sure, and that is an albatross around this administration's neck with voters. And the second is the internationalist, interventionist policy represented by this administration versus a more America First isolationist policy by Trump. Even split. Compared to 4 years ago, are your personal finances? Well, there's a gap there, and I'm going to read from here because the numbers are sharper. 28% are better off. That's higher than it was. On the other hand, 44% say that they're worse off. That's overall among Democrats. Not surprisingly, this has become a partisan issue since the Clinton presidency. Actually, Democrats are going to say they're better off because there's a Democrat in office, whereas Republicans, just about half as many, say that they're better off. Republicans, 2 out of 3 say that they're worse off because there's a Democrat in power, and independents, 43%, and that's critical. 43% say that they're worse off, even though it appears that they're voting for Kamala Harris. And compared to 4 years ago, America's standing in the world, a majority say that we are worse off in terms of our standing in the world. A little more than 1 out of 4 of Democrats say that. That's 28% say that the U.S. standing is worse off. 81% of Republicans and almost half, just about half, of independents.
Okay.
And which candidate would better steer the nation during turbulent times? And that is a wash. And we should point out that in our sample, we had an evenly balanced sample of Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah, virtually.
Pretty much, but 1 percentage point difference. 84% say Harris, 84% of Democrats say Harris, 89% say Trump. And interestingly, by a factor of 41% Democrats, or 41% Harris, 38% Trump among independents.
Okay.
Very important question. If your candidate is not declared the winner, will you accept the election results? 80% said that of Harris supporters said that they would. 65% of Trump's supporters. There is a 7% of Harris supporters would reject the results. 12% of Trump supporters. Now, you and I know that we deal with majorities. That's one thing. We also deal with intensities. We got to watch that 7 and 12% very carefully.
Yeah, and then on the not sure side, we do see that a quarter of Republicans are undecided as to whether they are going to accept the results. 13% of Democrats, and it could be interpreted that those folks are waiting for their cue,
I guess.
So that is it. And why don't we look at the comment boxes and
Okay.
take a look at some of the
I
questions?
just want to make a less than 1 minute comment. What we see here is a significant gender gap, uh, age gap, educational achievement gap, with Trump doing very well among those without a college degree versus Harris doing very well among those with a college degree. And so it's like these are significant gaps in urban suburban gap, urban suburban on one end and rural gap on the other. So let's take a look at the comments and questions.